So, Justin, thank you so much for coming. Not everybody has watched your podcasts or read any of your books. So, would you like to say a little bit about yourself first?
Yes, certainly. Thanks again for the invitation to come along. And I'm a journalist. I've been working primarily in Christian media for all my adult working life, really. For many years, I hosted a show that was both a radio show and a podcast and a video show called Unbelievable with a question mark. And that brought together Christians and atheists and people of other worldviews for dialogue and debate. So that was a wonderful introduction to what is sometimes called the world of Christian apologetics, and that's where I've spent a lot of my time talking and thinking and dialoguing. And so, yeah, over the years, I've written a couple of books. One kind of making the case for Christianity that was named after my show, Unbelievable. It's just about to be republished, actually, under a new name in April. And but my most recent book that is available now is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And that's really more a look at what's going on in our culture, and will be obviously something of the topic of today's conversation. And there's also an accompanying podcast documentary series, which sort of is a deeper dive than I go into in the book, into this waning of new atheism and the new conversation on God among secular intellectuals. I think you're still muted, Melanie.
I thought I'd left myself unmuted. There we
Mhm.
are. But in all the things that you've done, um, what has surprised you the most?
What has surprised me the most? I suppose just the thing that surprised me the most is seeing God work through. I suppose that shouldn't be surprising, but it's always is surprising when you see God work through a podcast, an interview, a video, and you hear of the most unlikely people coming to faith, which is always surprising, but shouldn't be unexpected. We believe in a God who can do the surprising and unexpected. So that's always, yeah, a great joy.
Would you like to share something about any of those stories to encourage us?
Sure. I mean, one particular story is quite personal to me because I work with him quite closely now. But someone called Peter Byram, who I got to know as a listener of this radio show and podcast, Unbelievable, many years ago now, 10 maybe, I don't know, 10, but yeah, anywhere between 10 and 15 years ago. He had a backstory of growing up in a Christian family, but he'd lost his faith by the time he went to university. Very much became enamored with the new atheist writings of people like Richard Dawkins. Um, but he ended up encountering the Unbelievable show and getting involved in the online discussion forum and that sort of thing. And I even ended up having him on the show at one point as an agnostic. But it was in, I believe, 2011 that we did a special tour with a Christian thinker called William Lane Craig. And Peter had sort of some skills in video editing. And he ended up actually helping us to create the sort of video promo for this tour. And he ended up coming along to some of the dates on this. And it was really during that period that he started to question whether he could sustain his atheism any longer, really. And he became a Christian by the end of that tour in October in 2011. Um, and he's just got a wonderful story of the intellectual and personal journey he went on. And it was very much influenced, obviously, by these many conversations he was listening to that I was hosting. But I wasn't the only influence, obviously, on his life. Well, the nice thing about that story is that I now work very closely with Peter. He's the sort of operations manager for my small production company, Think Faith. And so it's lovely to be able to work alongside someone who's sort of gone on that journey from atheism to Christian faith himself.
Hmm. And that's one of the things that really I've enjoyed in the book is hearing these stories of people who have come sometimes from absolute atheism, um, and have come to faith just through all sorts of different means, whether it was through sort of literature or poetry or science or whatever, to see God at work in people who you would think on a human level would have no chance of coming to faith has been really inspiring.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah. And I, I thank God for it. And there's obviously lots of different influences that go into that. But it's always a huge privilege to be part of that journey. And the important thing, of course, for me is that as much as I really enjoy the dialogue and the debate that happens on these shows, um, it would all be pointless if it didn't actually result in the end in people changing their mind and actually embracing Christian faith and living it out rather than just talking about it and debating it.
hmm. So here in the church in Wales, life is not always easy. It can sometimes feel a bit difficult and hard for us when we're sharing the gospel. It can feel like people are not always ready to hear the message, and there can be an atmosphere of almost giving up sometimes. So, what would you say to us here in Wales to encourage us from what you've learned and experienced?
Well, I would say that God is always in the business of surprising us, and there have been many periods in Christian history in many parts of the world when the church feels at a low ebb and things feel challenging. But I love the phrase of G.K. Chesterton, who said, "The Christian church has died many deaths and has experienced many rebirths because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave." And I think we should, obviously there are many times when we just have to hang in there and we have to keep praying, being faithful, even when around us it looks like things aren't going particularly well. But as I say, I think God seems to work through periods of renewal, and then that's often can be followed by long periods of when things seem to go quiet again. But you'll all know that Wales itself has this extraordinary history of having had revivals, and there's no reason why that can't happen again. The mistake would be to assume that God is somehow finished with the church when clearly that's not been the case historically. And I think, and really my book in some ways is hopefully a shot of optimism in the arm of many Christians who feel a bit disillusioned or cynical with the state of the church, and to say, actually, there are things happening right now under our nose which we may not quite recognize, but actually there are some very exciting things happening. And it feels like, as the metaphor I use in the book is that we're just starting to see the turning of a tide when it comes to faith in the West.
Yeah, we had great fun with that metaphor at the when we started our book club, and we found great riches in that metaphor actually, because we were thinking not only the point you make about tides going out, but that means they're coming back in again, but also that sometimes when the tide is at its lowest, that's when you find unexpected things.
Mm, this is true. Yes, yes. Well, when the tide withdraws, that's when the mudlarks can go to work finding all those buried treasures in the soil and so on, isn't it? So that's true. The way that a friend of mine, Glenn Scrivener, has put it, he says we've got an opportunity for low tide evangelism, and the reason he says that is that when when the sea withdraws, as it were, and reveals things that were previously buried, they were there but unseen. Suddenly, the tide going out can reveal them. And he would say that includes things like a sudden awareness of whether we can hold on to, for instance, the institutions and the values that have defined the West up till now. And sort of drawing on the work of the historian Tom Holland, he talks about the fact that the more that we're moving into this post-Christian world, and the more that that tide recedes, the more stark it becomes, the fact that these values and institutions that were essentially founded on Christianity, it becomes very apparent that we might not be able to hold on to them without the Christian story. And that's actually in itself is an opportunity to remind people of the Christian heritage of the West, and to challenge them to ask, well, why do you believe in the values of dignity, compassion, equality, progress, and so on? because it's very hard to sustain those on a simply sort of secular liberal footing. So I think I quite like that idea, that yes, there are opportunities that are presented by the Sea of Faith going out, because it forces one to think about why we do believe the things we believe in the end. So yeah, low tide evangelism is an interesting way of putting that.
Hmm. I found that when you look at that aspect in the book about the the way that our values can't be replicated in a secular environment because it, there's no basis to it. There's no ultimates, and how difficult that is for young people with the change in they don't know where they are.
Mm,
What's
mm,
right and good one moment changes the next
mm,
because
mm,
it's the popular opinion of
mm.
morality rather than anything um, firm and solid. And that seems to
Yeah,
resonate. I've got daughters who are
yeah.
now in their early 20s, and they've quite found it quite difficult to navigate.
I think that's right. And I seem to bump into that a lot myself. I think it's partly behind why there is such a mental health crisis as well in that generation, is that sense of not having something rooted, sort of floating around, having to invent your own identity and values and so on, is very exhausting and burdensome, I think, for young people. And so that again is one of those scenarios, though, which is actually creating, I think, the conditions for people to be able to hear and receive the Christian story again, because you can only survive for so long on this, this void, that we've created for ourselves, where we don't have a story to live by. And I think people are, and I'm seeing it interestingly, a lot of the research, even just very recently around Gen Z, is suggesting that they are starting to take religion, spirituality much more seriously again. I think partly because they feel cut adrift in that way.
Mm. And one of the things we really liked as well, you talk about the Christian story. You describe it as the story that makes sense of our stories. Could you
Mm.
say that a little bit more about that for those maybe who haven't read the book or come across that in your podcast?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, the one of the big images I try to sort of cast in the book is the idea that we're living in a meaning crisis. This is what psychologists describe as this world we've created for ourselves, where we've, as I say, cut ourselves off from the stories and traditions and communities that have tended to ground us in everyday life. And we've created this, you know, world that is mediated through screens and technology and everything else, but which offers us so many options and choices that it can become almost paralyzing in for people, as I say, who don't know where to turn and haven't been given a sort of a narrative, a story to live by. But we are, again, the psychologists tell us we are story-driven creatures. We need a story to make sense of our life. If we feel like we're just bouncing around chaotically with no beginning, middle, and end to the story, it leads to very bad mental health outcomes and everything else. Um, and the problem is that the new atheists, to a large degree, with their story of science and progress and reason, they tried to kind of replace the Christian story that had sort of faded from view with this sort of rationalistic story of reality. But it's not really a story that satisfies, because it's not a story that tells you if you have purpose or that there's any ultimate meaning to things. Um, it's a sort of a non-story, really. It's just a sort of nature will do what it will do kind of story. And so I think it created a sort of a void, and into a void, a vacuum tends to pull in lots of things. And so into that vacuum, that void, lots of other stories have been created, grasped for. And the problem is these are all insubstantial stories that are not enough to live our lives by. And they're quite quasi-religious stories. So they might be stories on the progressive left around sexuality and gender, and that may become someone's sort of sacred identity or story that they try to make the sense of their life through. Or it might be on the, political right, mythologies around savior characters like Donald Trump. That becomes someone's sort of story to try and make sense of life. The problem is these stories all collide and clash with each other, create the culture wars, and we get this sort of toxic, polarized culture with everyone sort of falling out with everyone else. So the problem, so my contention is that people are still looking for a story to make sense of their life, but they've forgotten the Christian story that once gave shape to the lives of countless people, whether they sort of consciously realized it or not. This was a story that told them that they had been created for a purpose, that they were made in the image of God, and that even though life was difficult, that God had come in person to walk in their shoes alongside them, and through his life and death and resurrection had sort of given them the hope for a kind of an ending, a way in which this story gets resolved, if you like. And that sort of idea of living within a story has shaped the lives of countless people. And when you take that story away, it's very destructive, because if you don't replace it with a story that makes sense of people's lives, then we do find ourselves in the midst of this meaning crisis. And hence why I think so many people in the stories they're reaching for, they're actually still looking for that original story, as it were, the Christian story. And I just think we've reached a sort of tipping point, if you like, in our culture where people are actually ready to hear it again, possibly for the first time, possibly, they have a dim memory of it in some way, but they're ready to hear it again, I would say.
And it is a very compelling story, isn't it? The Christian story. We were talking about it, those of us who did do the book club, that one of the things that brought us to faith in the first place and keeps us in the faith is the fact that it makes sense to us and
Mm.
it makes sense of the world around us. It that in a way that no other kind of story or paradigm does. Um, and we want to try and get that over. If you've got any advice for us to think on how to get that over to people, the wonder of the Christian story.
Yeah, I spend one chapter of the book, the final chapter of the book, really looking at how we can tell the story better to the people around us. And there's an episode, again, the final episode of the first season of the podcast that delves into this. And there are three particular ways in which I think we could tell the story better, to those around us. One of them is, I think we need to re-engage the imagination. And this comes out of the fact that a lot of my work and a lot of energy has been spent in the last 15 or 20 years in what's called Christian apologetics, because of the rise of these new atheists with these intellectual arguments against God. It led to a real blossoming, actually, in a good way, of lots of ministries and an approach to kind of trying to provide evidence for the case for Christianity, for God, and so on. And so I spent nearly 20 years of my life hosting this unbelievable show, which brought thinkers together to dialogue and debate these issues. But I think that's only half the story, because in the end, the problem is the church can be left answering the questions of yesterday rather than the questions of today. And I think we've moved on from that new atheist moment where those were the key issues in the public square. And it would and most people nowadays aren't approaching the question of God from this specifically intellectual point of view. They're not waking up in the morning asking for three philosophical proofs for God. They're probably waking up in the morning and asking for a reason to get out of bed. There's a sort of it's the more psychological, sort of existential sort of issues that I think are driving a lot of people today. The anxiety they feel, the sense of not having a purpose. And I think to engage that, you probably want to begin more at an imaginative level. You want to tell the story creatively, not just to sort of give them evidence and reasons, but to sort of start where they are. It may be engaging the passions and the interests that they have, if they're a sports fan or whatever, to get alongside them in whatever sort of the thing is, that the big thing that they love, that if they're passionate about their family and that kind of thing. It's to begin there, and in whatever way is appropriate to sort of start to tell the story in a way that makes sense for them. Um, so the person I often sort of pull out as a sort of a great example of this is C.S. Lewis, who was a well-known Christian writer, thinker, a brilliant apologist, wrote some really excellent works of Christian apologetics like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain. But I think it's unarguable that his most effective sort of books at actually drawing people into the Christian story were the Narnia Chronicles. And those were obviously works of fiction and imagination and fantasy. Um, and the reason that they worked, I think, was not because he sort of gave people a sort of rational proof for God. He made them want this story to be true, this story about talking animals and uh, a wise but not tame lion who ruled, and was going to defeat evil and bring spring out of winter and so on. And in doing so, he made a whole generation and maybe subsequent generations sort of wish that it were true at some level. And it almost gave them permission to take it seriously and opened the door to, well, what if it is true? What if it actually this could be reality in your world as well? Which he literally says to Lucy when she has to leave Narnia for the last time. He says, you must learn to know me in your world by another name. And I think it's not going to look the same in every instance, but we need to be a bit more like C.S. Lewis in grasping the opportunities that are in front of us to imaginatively tell this story and make people wish that it were true. And then may come the work later of that more kind of apologetic tradition of giving them reasons. But I don't think people are asking for the reasons right now. They're sort of, we need to sort of make them hungry for it, in the first place. And as I say, that's going to take lots of different forms depending on who the person is that we're talking to. But I'm quite encouraged to see some really good sort of imaginative ways of telling the story coming through, even, in our generation. I think The Chosen, for instance, which is this dramatized video series on the life of Jesus, is very well done. It's got excellent production values. It's thoughtfully done, imaginatively done. It's reached well beyond the Christian sphere in terms of its influence. And that's just one example where I think imaginative storytelling, in a sense, can really capture people. So that's one particular way in which I think we need to sort of maybe shift our focus a bit as Christians, and engage the imaginative side of people's personality a bit more. And there are other things that I could add to that. But perhaps we'll bring in more of them later.
Yeah, because the second thing you say in that chapter is that we should be being more weird, embrace being weird.
Yeah, that's right. And that seems counterintuitive. I mean, I sort of was schooled to some extent in a kind of form of church evangelism that was all about being as accessible and non-weird as possible, seeker friendly, and then suddenly, I'm not suggesting that we need to put up unnecessary barriers to people coming into church and feeling comfortable. But at the same time, Christianity has always been very weird. In fact, the reason it grew so fast in the first couple of centuries, was because of its very strange approach to life and the way it treated women and children and slaves, which was completely countercultural to the time and place that it was birthed. And yet this weirdness about it was one of its major selling points, if you like. And I think that's still true today. But the weirdness may have changed a bit because by and large, Christianity won when it came to our kind of moral instincts about equality and dignity and men and women and children and so on. It's not weird now to say we should treat everyone equally and with, inherent dignity. It was in the first century. It's not today because we essentially live in this Christianized West. So the question is, well, what continues to be the weirdness of Christianity? Well, it's other things. There's still a lot that's weird about being a Christian. And when I've had some conversations with secular friends, thinkers like, for instance, Tom Holland, the historian, who have sort of been on the margins of church and Christianity, they've often said to me the thing that will attract me to church and to Christianity isn't to sort of make it look the same as the culture, basically, sort of just secular humanism, sort of with some spiritual language sprinkled on top. It's the weirdness, actually. It's the fact that it looks so different. It's inviting me into a very different story of reality to what I can get already in public. So when he does go to church, Tom Holland actually goes to a very sort of high Anglo-Catholic church, the oldest church in London, St. Bartholomew the Great, which has this, this real kind of mystery and sense of the numinous, and this sort of enchanting choral music. I mean, and perhaps that's unsurprising. He's a historian. He's going to connect with something that feels ancient and everything else. But his advice is, to keep Christianity weird in that sense, both in its the worship, and whether it be a high church thing or kind of charismatic Pentecostal worship. He says his view is that people are looking for something that is different to their everyday. And I think that could be applied as well to, the things we say about what it means to be a Christian and how we live our life. If we sound just the same as any other public service broadcast, I think we do become invisible. And I think sadly it is the case that a lot of church denominations or traditions that have tried to essentially accommodate themselves to the culture so much when it comes to, obvious things like sexual ethics and so on. It hasn't proven to be some sort of recipe for revival, put it that way. Those tend to be the denominations that are stagnating and declining. And I think the reason is because if you're not saying anything different to what's already in the culture, well, why would I come along? I can get, I've already got that. I don't need to sort of turn up on a Sunday morning to hear the same thing. Whereas I think churches that have kind of embraced the weirdness, both of their worship and their ethic, are actually, it's not easy by any means, but actually I think they're starting to see that it's actually more attractive. People are kind of turning up because they're looking for something different. Actually, the way they've been living their life hasn't worked out all that well, as it turns out. The secular world doesn't deliver on its promises. And so when they see something, that initially looks weird, it can actually be, surprisingly attractive. And as I say, that's where I see the energy at the moment in the church is it's those churches that are certainly very welcoming, but kind of own their weirdness as well, that are actually seeing surprising numbers of people taking interest and walking through the doors.
I like the concept of owning our weirdness. It's
Yeah,
refreshing though, because I too was brought up on the sort of, seeker friendly, make everything as accessible as possible. And maybe you do lose something of what's special
yeah,
in becoming like everything else. I was interested to notice in some of the stories that you tell of people that the churches that they seem to have found their home in, lots of them have gone to the Roman Catholic Church, haven't they, or to Eastern Orthodoxy. And I
yes,
wonder if that is
yeah.
because they are more different.
I think that is to do with that. I think it's partly that looking people who are looking for something that is somewhat mysterious and isn't immediately obvious. And um and I think it's to do with the mystery and the awe and the tradition and the theatre that's often involved at one level in those traditions that does transport people out of their everyday. I think there's something as well about people looking for something ancient, something that sort of has stood the test of time, if you like. And I think that's especially true, bearing in mind what we were saying earlier about people feeling unrooted and in this very sort of postmodern culture where you can invent your own reality, uh, feeling sort of like they need something solid to come to rest on. And I think that's only exacerbated by the sort of uncertainty of the times we're living in, the political sort of polarization and, all the ground shifting underneath our feet, war on the edge of Europe, all kinds of things happening around us that feel um, that sort of take away the certainties that people have known, even for the last 50 years or more. And I think at that point people look for something stable. And when it comes to finding a tradition, uh, it's interesting to see a lot of people returning to something that their grandparents or great grandparents might have found more sort of you know yeah, would have been more familiar to them, or looking for the Christian story expressed in these sort of very ancient sort of ways. I would say, however, that this doesn't in any way discount, you know, Protestant evangelical forms of church. I just think that it's worth bearing in mind what, you know, to take a leaf, if you like, out of that and understand why people are being drawn towards those ancient forms of Christian faith, and asking, well, what is it about our tradition that is unique, that can offer that kind of stability and sense of rootedness, you know, in the past and in the present. I think that's the thing to take away from that.
Because we did spend some time thinking about that, because many of us on the court, who have done the book club, we're neither high church nor charismatic. We sort of, most of us were sort of conservative evangelicals, you're sort of straight sort of preaching and
Mm,
whatever. And we did spend some time thinking, well, what is attractively weird
mm,
about us, because we don't tend to have so much of the drama in
yeah,
worship.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know if you've got any
I,
thoughts on that.
well, yeah. I mean, it'll be sort of each individual church will have a different, you know, probably a different set of strengths and weaknesses that they'll need to think about. I mean, what I would say is simply that actually just being a church fellowship in itself is a great strength right now, a place where people can meet, be together, experience each other in a sort of human community. And I think churches really need to lean into that. We're all on Zoom today, and that's fine, you know, because I'm not in Wales with you, and it's very convenient. But I think if the pandemic taught me anything, it was that people quickly sort of realize that they need actual human people around them, and we can't do everything on a screen. And in an age where we are increasingly doing everything digitally, and a world in which AI is increasingly blurring the boundaries between whether you're even talking to another human being online or not. Um, I think we're increasingly going to find that church, just the simple act of getting together once a week to be together, uh, is a kind of quite a revolutionary and unusual thing. Uh, strange as that may sound, it's fast becoming one of the last places where you can do that on a regular basis, and do it with a group of people who are not necessarily the same as you. You know, that's the great beauty, I think, of the church at its best, is when it's people who are all quite different from each other actually coming around something that unites us, that's bigger than our differences. And I think there is going to be an increasing attraction to that, because people can only exist on this thin diet of um, everything being mediated through digital means for so long before they realize, you know, the true life is found in actually being with other people and rubbing up against them, as messy as that often is. Um, and so I think, you know, I wouldn't get too worried about sort of how do we make ourselves more weird. There's a distinctiveness and a weirdness just in doing what you're doing. And I know some churches who are, you know, pretty similar, you know, to what you've just described, sort of just basically down the line kind of conservative evangelical churches, who have been seeing some really interesting growth, without changing anything, without sort of creating a special program, but just people walking in who are saying, I've been looking for something like this, something that sort of grounds me, that makes sense of me, because they haven't been finding it. That's obviously going to be very varied, and where obviously a lot of the churches I'm sure that you folk represent are in quite rural areas, and that in itself can be a challenge. But having said that, I think that there's just something about being faithful and creating a place where people can find genuine human community that's quite revolutionary, you know, in our day.
Yeah, that's really encouraging, isn't it? The quality of relationship that you can
Mm.
find in a church family is attractive, isn't it?
Yeah,
When it's
yeah,
when it's done
absolutely.
well.
And it was interesting because it was one of the people who I don't mention in the book because her story came out after the book was published, but who sort of was a great sort of instance of this thesis of mine coming true in real life was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who some of you may have heard of, but she was arguably the world's most famous female atheist at one time. Sort of fled as a young woman, Somalia and the Muslim Brotherhood there, began a sort of secular life in the Netherlands, became very much a speaker on the New Atheist circuit, published her own sort of anti-religion book. But then only very recently, sort of at the end of 2023, wrote this viral article called Why I Am Now a Christian, and essentially channeling pretty much, a lot of the stuff that we've already been talking about, and the way in which she just found the secular story's reality couldn't make sense ultimately of her or the world that she found herself in. But it was really interesting because as someone who hasn't ever really been in church, to hear her talk about church, it's surprising how simple the things are that have attracted her and she's found really helpful. She says just being alongside other people, listening to a sermon, trying to pray, trying to sing the songs, having a cup of coffee afterwards, talking about it afterwards. She said, I never realized it could be like this. And you to many of us who may have been in church all our life, we think, well, that's what church on a Sunday morning looks like, maybe. But actually, for her, she's found it a bit of a revelation. She's like, it's wonderful the way that this happens, and there are people, and you can interact with them, and sometimes it's quite surprising actually how simple. We don't necessarily need to make it terribly complicated. There are when the time comes and people are looking for that kind of community again, as long as the church is open and there are people there to offer it, I think it'll become quite attractive again.